At this event where we talk about smart contracts, and smart contracts is the whole topic. And I've been asked to talk about smart contracts from a legal perspective, as this is something that lawyers have been discussing heavily, whether a smart contract is actually a contract in a civil sense or not. And what are we going to do today? Just a quick wrap up about the technical aspect of a smart contract, at least how I understand a smart contract as a lawyer, then the legal analysis of a smart contract, and then I will just briefly touch upon a few of the ELI principles on blockchain and smart contracts, and also give you some insights what the ELI is and what we do. For those who don't know me already, my name is Martin. I'm head of new technologies and attorney at law at EY Law Austria, where we advise crypto exchanges, crypto startups when they first move within their business model, and also at a later stage in corporate law with financing rounds, etc. Besides my role at EY Law, I'm also one of the project leaders at the European Law Institute, where we also gave advice on, work together closely with the European Commission and gave us advice on how to deal with blockchain and smart contracts. And our principles have been adopted actually 2 weeks ago, so I'm very happy to be able to show you a few of them today. Yeah, maybe to start, from a technical point of view, at least how I understand smart contracts, is that they are basically a program code that consists of an if and then condition, right? So if you have if something happens, for example, if you trigger the smart contract, then something else happens, and this is basically what a smart contract does. And that was actually one of my first tries when I tried to code a smart contract while I was doing my PhD on blockchain and smart contract. I thought I also need to code one, but it never compiled, so it's that's fair enough, but I'm a lawyer, so that's what I'm good at. Okay, so what are we here to talk about? At least for me, is the legal aspect of smart contracts, because I said it at the beginning. When lawyers hear the word contract, we always or very often think about whether this is a contract in a civil law sense, meaning whether there are parties to a contract and they're obliged to do something, for example. So that is why when talking about smart contracts, this was one of the key topics actually. And there has been a lot of debate, as I said already, because some argued that program code can never be a contract in a legal sense, and others argued against it. So my view is that you actually have to look at the characteristics of a contract, right? Under Austrian civil law, a contract consists of offer and acceptance. The offer actually means that you have to define what you want, for example, to sell, and it has to be sufficiently determined, meaning that you, for example, have to say the good or service that you actually want to offer and the price that you want to get in return for this service. And another key component is that you want to be bound by this offer actually, and then if those criteria are fulfilled, you would have a valid offer under Austrian civil law. And if there is then a corresponding acceptance, you have a contract in a civil law sense. And now, when we talk about smart contracts, what we have to do is we have to have a look and see whether those criteria, namely the offer and acceptance, can also be fulfilled by a smart contract. And in my view, and now there's some kind of at least somewhat consensus in Europe that this holds true. Also, a smart contract can be a contract in a civil law because parties can actually express their will via smart contracts. How can that happen, for example? When we, for example, think about a token sale, you could program a smart contract in a way that says if you send a specific cryptocurrency amount to the smart contract address, you will get a token in return, for example. So that is actually when we think about the offer again, where we have to determine what is the price, what is the good. Those criteria are fulfilled because we have the token, and we get the token in return, and we have the specified cryptocurrency amount. Then some argued that in such a smart contract you would never have the intention to be bound, because how could you actually express that you want to be bound by just a program code? And I argue in this case that you express that you want to be bound by your declaration in the smart contract by deploying the smart contract on a blockchain. Because when you deploy the smart contract on the blockchain, you know that you cannot, or you can hardly change the smart contract depending on the specifics of the blockchain, the specifics of the smart contract. But you typically know that once it is deployed, once it is public, people can interact with the smart contract and therefore, for example, trigger it and get the token in return. So in my view, this is enough to express that you want to be bound by this smart contract. And if we agree on that, we would have an offer in this smart contract, for example. And this offer then could be accepted just by sending the cryptocurrency amount to the smart contract, and then you would have a perfect smart contract that is also a civil law contract. So what does that mean, or how does that affect practice actually? What we have seen in practice on the one hand is that now startups are coming to us and ask us, they're using, for example, smart contracts when in their crypto, in their exchanges, etc., and they want to know whether those are valid contracts, whether they can, for example, how they can, whether the customers are bound by this contract, or whether they always have to have terms and conditions. And again, in our view, a smart contract can be binding, so this can be can be a legal agreement. But when it comes to the B2C interaction, we will have some further things to take into account, and we will touch upon that in a few minutes. Just taking into account the previous slide, namely that under certain circumstances, a smart contract can actually be a civil law contract. We have different types of smart contracts from a legal perspective. We would have, on the one hand, the smart legal contract. That is actually a legally binding declaration of will, such as an offer or acceptance. And on the other hand, we would have so-called transacting smart contracts that we would consider are not legally binding, or are not legal contracts, at least, so to say. This is, at least to our understanding for now, the bigger part of smart contracts being used are just transacting smart contracts, where you, for example, have an off-chain agreement and want to automate certain tasks. Then you would use a smart contract. This is typically not the legal agreement itself, but only, for example, something to automate the off-chain agreement. And in that case, it would not be as smart. It would not be a contract in a legal sense, actually. Yeah. So those are the main two things. Actually, the two types or different types of smart contracts, and this is something that we have also been discussing heavily during our Eli project. But I will touch upon that in a few minutes. Yeah. I think you will get the slides afterwards, and you can just have a brief look at the different possibilities of a transacting smart contract and a smart legal contract. For example, a transacting smart contract, as already outlined, is when you have typically an off-chain agreement. For example, you might have heard about Fizzy, I think back in 2018, an insurance policy that used smart contracts for the payout of insurance sums. And here you would have, you had an actual insurance policy that you concluded off-chain, and then the smart contract just looked up once you landed with your flight, whether your flight was delayed, and if so, you got an insurance payout. And this payout was automated, but this was not a legal contract as such, because we did not have an offer. We neither had an offer nor an acceptance on-chain. We just had some kind of an automation via a smart contract. And the smart legal contract, you just see here displayed what I already told you, that you would have the offer and acceptance on-chain. Like in the first step, you would program the smart contract in a way that says, that outlines what you want to sell and to what price, and then deploy it on the blockchain. And then actually third parties can interact with the smart contract, and we would have a legally valid contract. That all sounds quite theoretical, but in practice we have been approached quite a few times already with regard to the legal validity of smart contracts, and that this is a pain point also shows that the European Law Institute, which is one of the which is a very renowned institute of legal practitioners and legal academia all over Europe, also launched a program on smart contracts. It was called the Blockchain and Smart Contracts Program, and there we also worked closely together with the European Commission on developing some kind of guidance on how to deal with blockchain and more specifically with smart contracts from a legal point of view. You see here Professor van Erp, who was the project chair, and Juliette Seneschal and me were the two project leaders, and our team consisted of about 25 people. As I said at the beginning, the principles have now were adopted 2 weeks ago, and we're very proud that we can now finally show them in public, and they will be published on the ELI website probably next week. So maybe just to give you a few more insights on what we discussed within the group, and a few key principles that I would outline, and then I'm very happy to discuss in further detail afterwards, or also I'm also very happy if you download the principles and have a look at them. I think one of the key principles actually was that we in the group discovered that there is no one fits all answer when you interact with smart contracts or blockchain. So we can of course have some kind of principles, that's also what we did, but in fact you will always have to look at each case by case to analyze whether, for example, a smart contract is legally binding or not. Another thing that we came across within the group is that for legal questions it very often matters on what blockchain the specific application is deployed. And for our purposes, we identified 4 main types from a legal perspective of blockchains, so to say. Of course, being public and private blockchains as the 2 big categories of blockchains that also have, again, GDPR consequences, etc. You can imagine that there is a lot of legal questions and legal consequences of whether it is a private closed loop or it is public, and also with regard to what data you can share on chain. Principle 5 is a principle that I already touched upon when I talked about the different types of blockchains, because Principle 5 says that the triggering of transactions performed on a blockchain may amount to offer, acceptance, or any other contractual declaration, meaning that we state here in this principle a smart contract, so something that happens on-chain can actually have a legal effect also off-chain, for the off-chain world. And this is something that might seem obvious for some of you, because you might argue, why shouldn't it have any kind of effect if you have something on-chain and you want to express your will? Why shouldn't it have also effect to the off-chain world, for example? But this was actually the principle that has been debated the most within the group, because a lot of especially professors were argued that program code can never express a human being's will. And that is something we discussed a lot, and now we came up to the conclusion, and also in alignment with the European Commission, that we would argue also a human beings will can also be expressed via a program code, and that is actually a big step that might not seem so big in this crowd here, but is a big step for legal practitioners. Principle 8 is actually also related there too, because here we have the question, when we now argue that smart contracts can be legally relevant, we have the problem that a smart contract is coded in programming language. So the question that we now have to answer is, what is the contractual language? Is it natural language? Is it programming language? And can we agree upon that the contractual language is programming language, or can programming language not ever be a contractual language? Yeah.
The problem is everyone can look at a written contract, but
yeah.
not everyone can look at a written code.
Absolutely, and that is also something that we discussed here. So we took the way that we said, in general, parties can also agree upon programming language being contractual language. The thing then is that we have to examine again on a case-by-case basis whether this agreement was valid, right? In a B2C setting, in a business-to-consumer setting, you will, and that's also outlined here, you will most likely not be able to agree upon programming language as a contractual language, because consumers will typically not understand what the program language says, and also they will probably also not know how to access it at all. But in a B2B setting, for example, we would argue that this could be agreed upon, because in those settings, for example, it is also possible to have a contract in a foreign language that none of the parties understand. And maybe just two principles to conclude. Another topic that we discussed in the group was whether on-chain dispute resolution should be allowed or whether it should be banned, because especially from consumer protection associations, those arbitration agreements are very often argued that they are not valid. Again, we took the way here that we said, between businesses, we think that those arbitration agreements can be validly agreed upon, whereas in a B2C setting, this is most likely not the case. So nothing really new, but still it is new in the blockchain sector, and still all those principles were quite a long way to get them. And maybe just there is a whole part on consumer protection in the principles, a special part. I think it's 4 or 5 principles on how, for example, the different rights of consumers can actually be validly agreed upon in a blockchain setting. For example, what to do with the right of withdrawal. For example, if a consumer wants to end this contract, how to do it with reverse transactions, etc. So that are all very specific topics that we addressed in our principles, and you're very welcome to read them, or we can discuss them later. But the overruling principle is principle 13, stating that only because of the use of blockchain technology, the consumer protection cannot be overridden, meaning that you always have to take into account consumer protection and how to, for example, code that you can have a right of withdrawal or something like that, or how to take that into account, a cooling off period, etc. So that is the overreaching principle actually here. Which is again quite hard in practice to implement, but that was at least our common understanding how to deal with it. And yeah, we have shown these principles to quite a few people now, and yeah, I'm very happy to get some response. If you have comments or more comments, questions, please feel free to reach out now or later. I would be very happy to get your opinion.
So
yeah.
If I send a number of tokens to the contract address, and by this triggering a smart contract, is this not, as a consumer, then my free will expressed by sending the tokens already?
Yeah, that is actually a very good question because, and what we also discussed is whether, for example, you as a consumer always have to understand everything you do. Because I personally would argue, no, you don't have to understand what you do, because when you click, for example, in the internet, you also don't understand what happens in the backend. But again, you wouldn't understand the technological aspect of what happens in the backend, but you would see but you see what you're agreeing to, and that is not what's happening on chain at least. But typically, you would have some kind of a, for example, description. What happens if you send your tokens to the smart contract, and then this would be the content of your contract actually. And so, but it's still a very early stage, at least for all legal parties involved. A lot of, yeah.
Yeah, so what is the reason to even differentiate two groups of those, like smart legal contracts and like not legal ones? Is it bringing something new to the space? Is it opening some doors to smart contracts?
I mean, it actually helps, because when you know that you have a transacting contract, for example, a transacting smart contract that is not a legal contract, you would not have to deal with all the consumer protection issues, at least with the content of this smart contract, because it would just, for example, automate something that is already agreed upon, and it would really just be like the internet, like the computer, whatever, some kind of a technical instrument to execute a smart contract. Whereas the smart legal contract actually is the agreement. So in case there is a dispute, you would, if you argue that this is the agreement, you would have to actually look into the code and look what the code says. So so that is the big difference. And this is also something that we are now experiencing, that we get asked to have some kind of smart contracts legal audits, where they ask us whether startups, etc., ask us whether this contract or this smart contract can be used and can be agreed upon, and whether we, as EY Law, for example, can have a look at the terms, so to say. Yeah, that would be the desired outcome, at least. So that's basically why the differentiation is important. Yeah.
Maybe for a very basic question. I mean, most observations you stated there from a crypto economy quite obvious, but what needs to happen that is all becoming legally relevant? What you put forth in your study? Do we need amendments in national law? What is the path forward?
Well, that's a trick question. It's a very tricky question, because, as I said, we were a team of, I think, 25 people, all from different jurisdictions. And I think everyone has a different view on what has to happen and whether it needs some adaptation or not, whether the law needs adaptation or not. I think in Austria, we don't really need adoption. Our civil law, we can work with what we have. The only thing that might need adoption is when it comes to consumer protection, for example, right? If you have the right of withdrawal or something like that, that could be quite hard to implement on chain. So we might need some guidance here, or we at least give some guidance on how to deal with it. But our guidance is always that we just have to obey the existing law and have to make sure that the technical side, just somehow complies with applicable laws, meaning we need to have a right of withdrawal, for example. But that, of course, could be something that could be done on a European level, of course, to have some specific rules, for example, for blockchain transactions. Any other questions, comments? Yes.
Martin, how much of this can you use in your, let's say, daily business? Are there just a couple of cases where you can actually use what you've produced here in this paper, or are these just like limited cases, or is it widespread already?
I mean, what we see in our daily practice is that those questions are becoming more and more, but The bigger part of the questions in our daily practice is definitely supervisory law, right? Whether something falls within any supervisory law, a token, or etc. So that is the bigger part. But what we can use in our daily practice from this smart contract study is that we also face or ask the question of how decentralized, for example, a smart contract actually is, and this then affects again supervisory laws of whether for example, whether you have to register as a virtual asset service provider with the FMA, for example, and those are also questions when you have a decentralized exchange operated operating as a smart contract, whether this is a legal contract, and if it is a legal contract, whether it's centralized, because, for example, some holders of tokens or some wallet addresses get royalties, or whether it is completely decentralized. So that is one of the cases that we have touched upon in the principles already that we see now, and that there hopefully will be a follow-up project focusing on especially these questions of decentralization and how this decentralization affects laws. Yeah.
You said that we can work with Austrian law already with it, so what would you suggest in practice? Would that mean, just to get it in a human readable manner, would you suggest to print that code in one column and have the German or English translation on the second column, or what would you advise in practice to make a smart contract legal as a smart legal contract?
I mean, it depends, right? When you really have an off-chain agreement already, and you just want to automate, for example, the payout or something like that, you would have a really old, boring contract, and in this contract you would agree upon that the execution would be done via blockchain, via a smart contract. So I think that is quite old school and quite boring. You can do that. I'm pretty sure of that. But the real interesting question would be if you just deploy a smart contract and issue tokens and you do not really provide any further details in natural language, whether that would be valid too, and whether this exchange would be relevant from a legal point of view. And I would argue, yes, it would. Under Austrian law, it would be binding.
What's the point if I need a written contract and a...
Exactly. So I mean, you can automate things, and then you can, as I said, reference to the smart contract, or you try to really do something new and have only a smart contract.
Yeah, but then you separate the user. For example, when I go to an application, I have a privacy policy, RGPs. The user is doing one click and accepts all the RGPs privacy policies. So then I have to bring a second one to the user that he has to accept separately from the whole privacy policy. And this is for the user then a little bit complicated, no?
I mean, again, I think that you have the use case on the one hand that you really have something totally on-chain, and then only in those cases where you really would have most or the bigger part of the transactions being on-chain, this differentiation matters at this point in time at least. And whenever you have, for example, terms of conditions, T's and C's, you can agree upon pretty much. No, not everything, but yeah, some things you can agree upon some things in the T's and C's.
Yeah, but for daily using, this is relevant, so, you know? Huh?
Yeah.
Because nobody's reading the fucking manual, you know, so it's a matter of fact. So,
Yeah.
why complicate something? Honestly, when we talk about decentralization, you know, I have to tell you, in a real decentralization, I do not need a law, you know, because I have the technology and everything is written into that. Yeah?
But
But this is maybe a little bit,
But the thing is, exactly in that case, when everything is decentralized and when you really have something happening on-chain, this is that what we argue here is that we say this is also relevant from and binding from a civil law perspective. So no one can come to you afterwards and then sue you, for example, because the exchange was not valid or something like that. So that applies to those cases. And the other cases where you just automate things, etc., the question is whether you have to, whether it needs, whether the user needs to know that there is a smart contract in the backend, etc. I would argue in a lot of cases not. And in the other case which you mentioned, Georg, for example, when you agree upon executing some of the parts via smart contract, then you would reference to a smart contract. But in other cases, you would not really reference to smart contracts. So for the user experience itself, in most of the cases, this will not change anything. These principles mainly apply to the real decentralized world where you do everything or a lot of the things on chain, and this just, says, yeah, it should work, everything should work because you program it, and it's also legally binding. That's pretty much what our principle says in a nutshell.
Directly in terms of conditions.
No, I think if you do it in decentralized on-chain and just deploy a smart contract, that this is the legal agreement, and that you don't need terms of conditions to set another legal agreement. That's basically what they say. And again, with a disclaimer, just B2B for now and not B2C.
Boring.
Yeah, sorry, that's the law. I would very much like to tell you something else. Yeah.
What if I deploy a smart contract that is technically illegal to have an agreement on? But people pile up on it and use the smart contract, but I have nothing to do with it anymore. Who's responsible for that?
What does nothing to do with it mean?
I deployed it.
Yeah, but you don't get any royalties or anything out of it. And you knew that they would use it for illegal activities, or?
Well, I didn't knew it's illegal. I mean, it's a case in Tornado Cash.
Yeah.
That's basically it. He deployed it, and people use it, but he has nothing, and he's now in prison.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I mean, I think in Europe, this would be hard to actually imprison someone for just deploying a smart contract when you didn't know for what the users would use it, or when you, that's really a tricky question, because when you expected them to use it for illegal activities, it could again make you responsible for it. But if you, for example, programmed it for a totally different use case and then they just started using it illegally, this could be a good defense. But that depends. If he's a criminal, it depends on whether he knew it or he at least thought that it would be very likely that they used it for illegal activities. If he just programmed it for a totally different use case and he never thought of it that it also could be used for illegal activities, I wouldn't be so sure if he was a criminal. So, but okay, that's what you said. Yeah.
I don't know if you mentioned it before, but do you know any legal disputes in Austria or elsewhere? The case of in court or?
I mean, yeah, we discussed in the group. We discussed a few disputes where they, for example, where it has been argued, but none of them went to court. All of them have been settled. So we don't really know how courts would actually deal with a smart contract. But what we discussed in the group was that, for example, there were smart contracts issuing tokens, and then the token holder claimed that the token should have totally different utilities, etc., and sued for them. But you know, they settled. So we don't really know what a court would have said, but they pretty much would have said it needed to be translated, and then according to civil law, it has to be examined whether any kind of utility was was actually bound to the token and what the people expected the token to have for utility. But we're still awaiting real courts, real proceedings before courts, because, and then we hope that our principles are being referenced there.
I can imagine that it would be already really hard to decide which court it would be, right, because of the location.
Yeah, that is also something that we discuss in our principles, and we would argue in a context of a smart contract where actually two people interact with each other. The mere fact that the smart contract is located decentralized over a lot of different jurisdictions should not by itself mean that it's, for example, an international contract, and that we have to apply international law, international private law, but that we just have to look at the connection between the two parties interacting, whether we have an international law aspect. But a good point, absolutely. Anything else, or should we start with the watch party? Yeah, sorry.
Do you feel it was a mistake to name the smart contracts as contracts in the first place? Just programs, you know?
I think that was actually one of the key issues why there is so much legal debate going on smart contracts, yeah. And that was also actually one of the reasons why in 2017 or 16 I started my PhD on blockchain and smart contracts, exactly analyzing whether they are contracts or not. So, and I probably wouldn't have started that if they were named differently. So, yeah, I think we would have less problems.
Programs, how about them?
Agreements?
Wouldn't go with agreements. Okay. Yeah.
After how many confirmations, if you send the tokens to the contract address, after how many does it count as accepted? Because you could double spend theoretically.
Yeah, very good question again. We also addressed it in our principles. We think that and this is where it becomes very tricky. We think that, or we argue that either once a transaction cannot vanish from the blockchain, or when the party of actually having control over the smart contract knows that the smart contract has been triggered. If either one of those cases happens, the smart contract is valid as legal contract. Yeah.
Question is, for instance, we have a smart contract, legal smart contract. We have parties who is interacting with the smart contract, and in some time we have a vulnerability somewhere in the smart contract, but we didn't know that beforehand, before it comes. And in that case, for instance, some users lose monies or something else, they lose some assets, whatever. And who is responsible in that case?
Yeah, again, very much connected to your question. The question of who is responsible is really hard to answer, right? And this, when we talk about, for example, in supervisory law, the question always is whether someone controls the smart contract or benefits from the smart contract. Meaning, for example, if you get royalties or any other benefits from transactions, then you could be considered as the owner of the smart contract, and then you could be liable depending on what kind of warranties you give or what people expect from you for the smart contract. For example, if you go online or if you post your code on GitHub and say this is the best, it's super, it's perfect, you can always interact, it's super safe, then you might have a problem. If you just say it is a usual programming code, it can have bugs, etc., then it's much better. And if you don't say anything at all, I would argue that it's always the second one. So that's pretty much it. Anything else?
That was a lot already.
Yeah, yeah, I think so too.
People may still have some questions, but thank
Yeah.
you very much.
Yeah, thank you.